Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I'm your host, Paul Rader. You want politics? I've got politics for you. Today is going to continue our little series on voting policy reforms. Last week, we began this short series of episodes that center around how voting policy has changed over time. But while that episode focused more on the actual process and function of voting, today's episode will be focused on the accessibility of voting. We've come a considerably long way since those days where different demographic groups were unjustly barred from voting for our elected officials, but this episode isn't just about expanding which American citizens have the right to vote, or what we also call suffrage. How have our methods of voting changed? When did we start seeing primaries? And as with the process of voting, many of these changes to voting accessibility are taken for granted now, but once were novel ideas or faced serious roadblocks to implementation. So, let's dive into it. First off, changing the methods of voting. So I'm talking about things like early voting and absentee voting, also called mail-in voting, because typically that's how absentee voting is done. In the case of early in-person voting, we're talking about voting in person, but on a day that is not designated election day. So election is on a Tuesday. You might be voting on a Sunday or Saturday or Friday or some other day before that day comes. Oftentimes, early voting polling locations are different than the one that you go to on election day. And also, you usually have more options of where to go on early voting days than on election day, where you're typically just designated for one place. And according to a Time magazine article, the first instance of early in-person voting was in Texas in the late 1980s, and now it's a very commonplace thing that you see. In fact, as of February 2024, 47 states allow early voting of some sort. And most states' allowances for early voting ranges between 10 to 30 days. There's a few that are outside the range, are either higher or lower, but that's typically where it falls in. And of course, like with many things, what that looks like varies between states and sometimes even within states. You might have some counties within a state that do not have that full range of early voting dates that a state allows for. So maybe the state says you can open early voting 21 days before the election, but you might live in a county that only allows it for 2 weeks, so 14 days. Or maybe they don't let you do it the day before the election, but 2 days before the election, and 3 and 4 and 5. Really just depends on where you live. So even when a state allows you to vote early for a given number of days, your county might not necessarily be open for that many days because the states allow these counties to have some discretion as to how long they have early voting for. And not only has it been increasingly common to see states implement early voting, it's been increasingly common to see voters using early voting. In fact, according to the Associated Press, over 85 million voters in the presidential election cast an early voting ballot. So it is, if it hasn't overtaken election day voting yet, it probably will at some point. At least that's what the trends say is going to happen. And then for absentee voting that does not happen in person, typically vote by mail, you have two basic kinds. You have the excuse required and you have no excuse required. No excuse just means basically anyone can request that ballot. An excuse means you need a reason that the state considers legitimate to request a ballot. Maybe it's a medical issue that you have and you can't actually go in person to vote, or you have an out-of-state trip, or you have some sort of inability to travel. And what excuses a state allows will be different. If you go to state A, they might allow 5, 6, 7 reasons that you can request an absentee ballot, but then state B gives you only like 3 or 4 reasons that you can use to request a ballot. But every state provides for either excuse required or no excuse required. All 50 states do that, and so does D.C. Back to that Time magazine article, though, and this cites, I'm hoping I'm saying his name correctly, Paul Gronke. He's a political science professor at Reed College and the founder of the Early Voting Information Center. But he says that excuse required absentee voting goes all the way back to the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln wanted to assure that he got votes from soldiers that were serving away from home in his 1864 election against George McClellan. So unlike early voting, although technically absentee voting can be considered early voting because you can mail it in early, but it's a surprisingly long history that absentee voting has, although obviously not quite like what it is today. And 14 states require an excuse for requesting an absentee ballot. And again, what excuses are considered legitimate depends on the state and possibly even the local level. And the other 36 states do not require an excuse. And then lastly, we have 8 states that have automatic mail-in voting, which means that every voter receives a mail-in ballot by default. Does not necessarily mean that it's mail-in only, but several states do allow you or do have it as default that you get a mail-in ballot, though Vermont only does it for general elections. Next up, development of primaries. In the 19th century and before, candidates for office predominantly selected by caucuses, and you also had conventions. Caucuses are more private meetings held by members of the party, and they are not necessarily secret ballot like today, where you would go into a primary. And even the few times that caucuses do still exist, sometimes those caucuses will be secret ballot as well. But a lot of caucuses, at least back then, were not. Talked a little bit about voice voting back in the last episode of the podcast. Talked a little bit about how voting was done by voice really early on. So you had some of that going on in the caucuses. And then conventions are more general meetings where delegates of the party attend. So it's caucuses and conventions that were the predominant methods of nominating candidates for office for the parties. And while they still see some use, the early 1900s saw the beginnings of the primary election system that we see today. It was one of those many progressive era reforms that progressives of that time felt would address political corruption. It was starting to take power. They were aimed at taking power away from the political machines and party bosses who controlled nomination processes. And it did do that over time. And over the course of the 20th century, more and more states started to implement primaries. And so today, the vast majority of states use a primary of some sort. But what that primary looks like can drastically differ both from state to state and sometimes even within a state. One party might use one type of primary within a state while another party uses a different primary type. Or a state may use different primary types for presidents, Congress, and state-level offices. But the basic types of primaries you see are closed primaries, which means you have to vote. Whatever your party affiliation is, you have to vote in that party's primary. So if you're a Republican, you got to vote in the Republican primary. If you're a Democrat, you got to vote in the Democratic primary. Then you have open primaries where you can decide which party primary you're going to vote in. You might need to, when you go to vote, you might need to change your party affiliation the day of to vote in that primary. But in any case, you have a lot more. You don't have to be registered with that party however many days in advance. Like, for example, in Florida, it's my state. It's a closed primary state. You need to be registered 29 days before the election. And even if you are registered 29 days before the election, you can't just change your party affiliation during that time and then vote in your new party's primary. It has to be in that party primary that for the party that you were registered for 29 days prior. And you see a lot of states that do that kind of thing. Whereas in open primaries, you basically can choose which party primary you want to vote in. Then you have a semi-closed primary, which is kind of in the middle of a closed and open primary. So if you're a Republican, you still have to vote in a Republican primary. If you're a Democrat, you still have to vote in the Democratic primary. But if you are an independent, you're not affiliated with any party, you can actually choose which party primary you want to go in. So it's not closed if you don't have a party, but if you do have a party, it is closed to you. Unless one party uses a semi-closed primary and then the other party uses a closed primary. Unless something has changed, Massachusetts, I believe, does that, where I believe it's the Democratic Party there that has the semi-closed, and then the Republican Party has the closed primary. I might be wrong about that, but I believe that is how Massachusetts does that, just as an example. You also have a top two primary, which you predominantly see in Washington and California. So all the candidates are on the ballot, and in the primary, the top two vote getters go to the general election. So you can theoretically have two Democrats, two Republicans, two third-party people. Probably not going to happen because they don't get enough support. You might have two independents going at the same time, or in the general election. Whatever the case may be, top two vote getters go on to the general election, regardless of how many votes each one gets. So even if the first place vote getter got 99% of the vote, and then the second place vote getter got like 7/10 of a vote, they still both go to the general election. And then you have something similar called a top four primary, which we see in Alaska, which Alaska just implemented recently and almost got rid of in this past election through ballot measures. But it's just like a top two primary, except it's the top four vote getters go on to the general election. And then lastly, the last basic type of primary is one that's specific to Louisiana. You'll find Louisiana has a lot of quirks about its political system, and the way that Ballotpedia describes it succinctly is the Louisiana majority vote system. So in Louisiana, it looks a lot like a top two primary, where all the candidates are listed on the primary ballot, and the top two vote getters go on to the general election. However, in Louisiana, unlike the top two primary, if one of those two candidates gets a majority of the vote, they win outright. So it's not like in the top two primary, where if the first place vote getter got 99% of the vote, they still go on to the general election. In Louisiana, if they did get that 99%, they would win outright. They don't have to worry about a general election. So that is the basic rundown of the development of primaries. Now, on to the meat of this episode, and we're talking about the expansion of voting rights. So this is going to be more chronological order. The U.S. Constitution originally left a lot of policy on voting rights up to the states. There was lots of limitations by the states on who could and couldn't vote, which had to be whittled away over long periods of time, including by the federal government. A common motif of constitutional amendments was expanding suffrage, but there was also other federal legislation that expanded suffrage as well. In the case of constitutional amendments, it was predominantly the 15th and 19th Amendments, but you also had ones like the 23rd and 24th Amendment, which we'll go into more detail with later. But the most famous federal legislation that wasn't a constitutional amendment was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we'll, like with the constitutional amendments, we'll get to that in a little bit. But this is going to take a chronological view of how voting rights were expanded. And the 1920s through the 1960s, or 1920s and 1960s, saw a lot of movement in particular towards enfranchising demographic groups that previously were hindered from voting. Like I said, voting rights were largely left up to the states through the U.S. Constitution, but all of them were still very restrictive about who could vote for a very long time. And this is mostly through the 10th Amendment, which basically says powers not expressed in the U.S. Constitution or expressly given to the federal government are given to the states. So the first domino to fall in terms of restrictions on voting, most people, or a lot of people at least, know about racial minorities not having the right to vote initially. Women did not initially have the right to vote. 18, 19, 20-year-olds not having the right to vote. Fairly well known for the most part. But many people don't know that originally not even all white males got the right to vote, because you had to be a property owner. Especially in the 18th century and before, property ownership was a very, very big deal. Your status, your rights, basically your whole meaning for existence came from owning property, at least in society's eyes. Many people in the colonial era worked as what were called indentured servants, because at the end of their contract, they would receive their own property. And indentured servants would sign a contract for 5, 6, 7 years, depending on the contract. And they would do basically anything that the, for lack of a better term, employer wanted them to do. And then at the very end, they get their own plot of land. And that's how a lot of people gained land in that era. Now, when it came time to write the U.S. Constitution, some, though not all, of the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution were interested in expanding voting rights to groups other than propertied white males. Not in every case. Some founding fathers and framers thought about expanding voting rights, but a lot of them did not. In fact, John Adams, in a 1776 letter to James Sullivan, who was an early American statesman, he would eventually become the governor of Massachusetts, basically says about men without property that because they don't have property, they aren't educated enough on public affairs, so they can't make an informed decision, and that they're too dependent on other men to have their own will, and they'll just vote according to the interests of the propertied men. Of course, I'm not saying that non-propertied white males had it as badly as women and slaves did. I'm not saying that, but they did have some restrictions on what exactly they could do as well. And you started to see property qualifications for voting. They started to be phased out beginning in the 1820s. It was a state-by-state change. Again, remember, 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. But North Carolina was the last to implement the property requirement, and that didn't happen until 1856. But a lot of states had gotten rid of that property requirement well before then. So it eventually became all white males who were citizens could or had the right to vote. Now we move on to some of the more well-known constitutional amendments that expanded the right to vote. But before we could get to the 15th Amendment, which expanded the right to vote to black men, before black people could vote, though, their citizenship status had to be resolved. Think about, obviously, this was the time of slavery, or and immediately following slavery. You had the 3/5 compromise that was originally in the U.S. Constitution, where slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person for population counting purposes, which boosted the power of slaveholders. But the Dred Scott decision from the Supreme Court further boosted their power by saying that slaves were property. They were not people. They were not citizens. So not even free black men were considered citizens at the time. Yeah, they weren't slaves, but they weren't doing much better than slaves were. And then so it wasn't until the 13th Amendment, which was ratified on December 6th, 1865, that outlawed slavery, but it did not grant former slaves citizenship. That came with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted citizenship to all people born in the U.S., regardless of skin color or previous enslavement, though that did not extend citizenship to Native Americans who did not pay taxes. A little more on that shortly. But then you had the 14th Amendment, which was ratified on July 9th, 1868, which granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S. That would supersede the Three-Fifths Compromise and then enshrined the Civil Rights Act of 1866 as part of the Constitution, not just regular federal law. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was sort of a template for what would become the 14th Amendment. So then we finally get to the 15th Amendment, where black men obtain the right to vote, and that's ratified on February 3rd, 1870. However, while they legally had the right, following slavery, you saw what we call Jim Crow segregation. Jim Crow was not an actual person. It was a racist caricature of black people. And they also instituted what were called black codes, particularly in the South. So black people were technically not slaves, but it was an attempt to recreate the conditions of slavery as closely as possible. So they used things like poll taxes, where you had to pay to go vote, literacy tests, where you had to be able to read and write at a certain level, and then grandfather clauses, which in a way were actually the most insidious, because so back then, because of slavery and all the oppression that black people faced back then, they tended to be poorer, and they also tended to be more of them tended to be illiterate. What grandfather clauses did was, because there were also poor, illiterate white people as well, but what these grandfather clauses did said basically, if your grandfather had originally had the right to vote before these laws were passed, you basically got to bypass all these other stipulations. So a lot of times these poor white males got to go past poll taxes and literacy tests, so they still rather conveniently only applied to black voters. And so, yes, they technically had the right to vote, but in theory, but in practice, they rarely were able to exercise that right to vote because of these racist governments putting forth all this Jim Crow segregation. So, in any case, though, they do get the right to vote from the 15th Amendment. And then later on, you get the 19th Amendment, where women were guaranteed the right to vote. So that's ratified on August 18th, 1920. And there's actually a bunch of states that let women vote prior to the 19th Amendment, the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Not necessarily for all elections. Some might have only let them vote for president and Congress, but not necessarily for state level or local level races. But Wyoming was the first state to let women vote when it became a state in 1890, which earned it the nickname the Equality State, and the state motto, equal rights. It actually had extended the right to vote to women when it was still a territory. But like I said, some states only let women vote for president, but not for other offices. And then there was still the issue that minority women were restricted from voting due to discriminatory laws. So, again, though in theory they had the right to vote, in practice they didn't really actually get to exercise it much. Now that might lead you to this question of, well, what about other racial minorities? We're talking about black voters getting the right to vote, but what about other racial minorities? So the 15th Amendment did not grant all racial minorities the right to vote because there were still issues with granting them citizenship. And one of the early instances of those issues being eroded away was on June 1st, 1924, when the Indian Citizenship Act granted Native Americans the right to vote. Technically, the 15th Amendment could have done this from the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But in practice, the 15th Amendment was mostly applied to black men because Native Americans were not considered citizens at that point until this act in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act. And then you had in 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed by the Magnuson Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act had been law since 1882. It was a discriminatory act that stemmed immigration from China and denied immigrants the ability to naturalize and gain citizenship and therefore vote. So there was a lot of Chinese immigrants coming over to the West Coast, especially participating in believe they were there during the gold rush as well. They faced a lot of discrimination, and so some of them would also move further eastward. Chicago, for example, has a large contingent of Chinese Americans today. So you have to remember back then, relations with China are not like where they are now, where they're, to put it lightly and succinctly, they're tense. But in the wake of World War II, where the U.S. and China were allies, relations between the two had softened. And so with the Chinese Exclusion Act getting repealed by the Magnuson Act, they became the first Asian Americans eligible to naturalize and gain citizenship and therefore vote. And then in 1952, we had another milestone where the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, also known as the McCarran-Walter Act, had passed, which gave all Asian Americans citizenship and the right to vote. Although, unfortunately, it did still keep some of the immigration quota systems that from before in place, where, okay, this is the exact number of citizens from X country that we're going to allow to legally immigrate to the United States. They still kept some of those quotas in place, but nevertheless, it did still at least allow for some progress, giving them citizenship and the right to vote. And then so that leads us into the 1960s and 1970s. The 23rd Amendment is a little bit different. It wasn't really an expansion of, I guess in a way it is an expansion of voting rights demographically, but based on where people lived. Because in the 23rd Amendment, which was ratified on March 29th, 1961, it allowed Washington, D.C. residents to vote in presidential elections, and they also got electoral college votes similar to a state. Now, there are still debates today about making them a state, but in any case, they get electoral college votes as if they were a state, and Washington, D.C. residents can vote in presidential elections. Before passage, D.C. residents had to have registration in one of the states to be able to vote for president. Now, they don't need to do that. They can be registered in D.C. And then you had the 24th Amendment, which finally abolished poll taxes. And that was ratified on January 23rd, 1964, because that was one of the major tools that were used, particularly by southern states, to disenfranchise black voters. They were often too poor to pay the taxes. And like we said before, poor whites often circumvented the poll tax through means such as the grandfather clause. And then on August 6th, 1965, you had the Voting Rights Act of 1965 signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. It enforced the 15th Amendment at the federal level and banned literacy tests and other discriminatory practices used to disenfranchise black voters and, by extension, other racial minorities. And so, since then, the Voting Rights Act has been extended and expanded several times. On August 6, 1975, amendments signed into law by Gerald Ford requiring districts with high numbers of non-English speakers to be provided with instructions and assistances in registering and voting. And on June 29th, 1982, Ronald Reagan signed a 25-year extension of the Voting Rights Act. And then lastly, on this front of expansion of voting rights, you have the 26th Amendment, which decreased the minimum voting age from 21 to 18 years old. And that was ratified July 1st, 1971. Now, some states already let 18, 19, 20-year-olds vote, maybe not necessarily for every single election, but some elections. But Congress was being really pressured to extend suffrage to 18 to 20-year-olds, as many of them were drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. I'm trying to remember the exact rallying cry. It was something like old enough to die, old enough to vote, something along those lines. But you had in the Oregon versus Mitchell case in 1970 for the Supreme Court had ruled that Congress could lower the voting age for federal elections, but did not have the power to do it for state and local elections. And in response, Congress passed the 26th Amendment, and it was ratified by enough states in less than 4 months, which is a record for a U.S. constitutional amendment. So now that was the last constitutional amendment to really address expanding voting rights, expanding suffrage. And then on our last point for this podcast episode, the changes to the accessibility of voting that we've seen more so from the 1980s to the early 2000s. So the 1980s and through the 2000s saw major legislation on voting rights related to physical accessibility. On September 28th, 1984, Ronald Reagan signs the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, which required polling places in federal elections to accommodate for disabled and elderly voters. Then on May 20th, 1993, Bill Clinton signed the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, also called the Motor Voter Law, which required motor vehicle agencies to offer voter registration opportunities, states to maintain current and accurate voter registration lists, and opportunities to register to vote at certain state and local offices. So if you have been to the DMV recently and you're a young person, that they also asked if you wanted to register to become a voter, or in states that allow it, if you're close enough to 18 years old, you can also pre-register to vote. So when you do become 18, you will become a registered voter. There are some places that do that. And then on October 29th, 2002, George W. Bush signs the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, which mandates that the U.S. Election Assistance Commission improve and certify voting equipment, maintain national voter registration form, and administer a national elections clearinghouse with shared practices. So obviously, this isn't by any means like a fully comprehensive list of the expansion of the accessibility to vote. That there's not enough time in a podcast episode to talk about that. But these were just some of the really big instances of that being the case. So we've obviously come a really long way since then. And fortunately, obviously, some of the wrongs of the past have been righted. And there's still some debates today about voting accessibility, but that will be in a future episode for this series. So just a bit of a rundown of the changes we've seen to the accessibility to voting. But anyways, that's going to do it for today's podcast episode. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Share it with all the people you know, and even ones you don't know. Links in the show notes, my Facebook page, Paul Rader, author and speaker, my LinkedIn, my Matchmaker FM profile, for being a guest on this podcast, or for me being a guest on your podcast. We can obviously talk about that. My short educational email course for free about some of the mistakes we make when trying to depolarize American politics, and how we can, or why we make those mistakes, and how we can correct those mistakes my book on Amazon in ebook and paperback format, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Can Become More Competitive. And I think that's it. So once again, as always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.